Hi guys, BuildZoid here, and so today we're just going to take a look at the transient response performance of the MSI X570 Godlike and the Gigabyte X570 Aorus Xtreme. So yeah, I'm going to link, if you have no idea what this video is about, I'm going to link another video down in the description below that's going to add context, and then you probably will have to watch some more videos for even more context potentially, but there I will include a video that gives the sort of the bare minimum of context. So anyway, let's talk about the performance results. So first up, let's just individually look at each board versus its own LLCs, and then we're going to try compare them against each other because the thing is, like, so with the Godlike, Mode 1 LLC is a bad idea. Okay, it is just objectively not a good amount of LLC to be running. It consistently, like, so in 32K FFT size, you know, we have, what is that? That's a 60 millivolt gap between the SVI2 TFN reading and the DyeSense voltage reading. It is worth noting that on the Godlike, because of where the DyeSense circuitry is located and how I'm connecting to it, there's a lot of noise on that measurement. So I don't consider it super accurate, but it shouldn't be that wrong. It's just, yeah, it's not great. I'm not very happy with the measurement, but the thing is like, the only, like, in a perfect world, I would just have a bit of coax going directly to the CPU package. Unfortunately, that is not something I want to do with a 3950X. it's the CPU is soldered, it costs way too much, and I don't really want to break a 3950X just to get some measurements, or risk breaking a 3950X that much just to get some measurements. So I also don't really want to buy another CPU just so that I don't break the one I already have. Anyway, so, you know, like, this measurement's not great, but we have it, and we also have the minimums here, and we can see that the difference there is, like, these are back of socket measurements right here, and those show a similar difference, right? The issue with the back of socket measurements is, well, the impedance of the motherboard and the CPU socket is between us and the actual CPU, so we are seeing a sort of attenuated version of the voltage waveform that the actual CPU is experiencing. So we are not like, I can't measure what the CPU is actually getting, but we're getting, like, it doesn't seem to be too much of a problem. There are some platforms where the difference between what you get on the back of the socket and on the DyeSense is absolutely huge, but this is not one of them. So yeah, anyway, so, you know, here we can see that's a 60 millivolt gap. This is a 40 millivolt gap. And then if you go, and Mode 2 LLC really doesn't do anything for it, right? This is still a 40. This is still a 60 millivolt gap. So yeah, you can actually see how the minimum here. Well, that might actually be the noise that's being picked up by the signal. Like, this could potentially be the same, like, this is maybe the same gap as what's over here, but there's a bunch of noise on that, so hard to say. Anyway, but then if you go to mode 3, well, 1.206 to 1.16, that's a smaller gap. There's one issue with the Godlike, and that's that MSI has the voltage steps limited to just 12.5 millivolts, which is kind of like, those are big voltage steps. So basically, I had a choice between running 1.194 and running 1.206 for mode 3 LLC, and yeah, not really a great choice, but anyway, I went for 1.206. With Mode 3 LLC, you know, we pick up some minimums, so that's pretty good. The undershoot's been reduced, and we can see the same effect on the back of the socket, but we can also see that our average voltage has gone up, so this is probably, like, it looks like, if you just look at the minimums, it kind of looks like there's a 20 millivolt improvement, but considering the average has gone up 10 millivolts, this is probably not actually a 20 millivolt improvement. It's probably closer to 10 millivolts, but yeah, also the overshoot has improved a little bit. We've gone from 1.36 to 1.35, so that's nice. Then going up to 1.2875 volts on mode 4 LLC, we see 1.2 volts with 1.16, so now this is like, okay, this is actually a 20 millivolt improvement over mode 2. We also see the same on the back of the socket, so I do not see a reason to suspect these results of not being real. Then going up to mode 6, we still don't really see an improvement, though. right? So if you go all the way up to mode 6 in Prime 95, 32K FFT size, at like mode 4 is enough. Essentially what this is saying is if you have a, not the, like, the worst case scenario is 192K FFT size Prime 95. So if you're benching like Cinebench or various relatively mild benchmarks, mode 4 LLC should work just fine. Now if we look at the 192K FFT size results, things get quite a bit different. So, and we're actually just going to ignore this idle data. I don't know why I ended up collecting it. I know I did that for Z390, but ultimately I just kind of decided, like, why, like, at this point, I was like, what are we even going to, it's idle, who cares? Anyway, so let's talk about the, so the 192K results. So mode 1 LLC, is really low. Like now we're seeing a 90 millivolt gap here, and that is a 70 millivolt gap. So there's still that 20 millivolt worse undershoot difference between these two results. But again, that could just be the noise that the dye sense is picking up. So I wouldn't, put too much weight into that. Going to mode 2 actually leads to a mild improvement in undershoot, which you'd expect. It's kind of surprising that 32K didn't show one, but at the same time, my oscilloscope doesn't necessarily have that. Like, the thing is, 10 millivolts, with rounding, like, I wish my oscilloscope had a third digit. Like, it doesn't measure to, fourth digit. It doesn't measure to four digits if, for measurements. Like, it'll happily show you 999 millivolts, but it will not show you 1.001, right? Which is like, I'm pretty sure it's just a software restriction, but oh well, that's what I get for having a cheap scope. Oops. So anyway, yeah, so here we see a bit of an improvement, but nothing really that huge. Then going up to mode 3, we start seeing an even bigger improvement, but again, the average voltage is up again. And this improvement is replicated on the back of the socket as well. Then once we hit mode 4, we get 1.15 volts with 1.23 minimums on the back of the socket as well. So again, slight improvement of about 10 millivolts even over mode 3, even though mode 3 is averaging a higher voltage. So I'd consider this actually a more significant improvement than I would consider this, because this gap is 50 millivolts, but this gap is 30, right? Whereas this gap is 60 millivolts. So if the board actually allowed us to use 6 millivolt voltage steps instead of 12.5 millivolt voltage steps, I would expect this to actually be like 1.21 instead of 1.22 at 1.26 average. It's just that the board doesn't do voltage steps that small. I don't really consider that a big deal. It's just like ultimately, I think MSI does it as a convenience thing because their voltage controllers support 6.25 millivolt voltage steps. Like it's the requirement for the AMD CPUs. Like you can't have that's a requirement of the VRM. So the VRM can do it. MSI just chooses not to have that in the BIOS because, well, to be honest, yeah, like, well, I don't know. I guess it saves you some time if you're like scrolling through the voltages or something, but at the same time, I kind of feel like, but it's like, it'll just take you twice as many clicks or, keystrokes to get to the next voltage. Like, that's not really a big deal, but anyway, still, point stands. Mode 4 actually, so mode 4 looks really, really good. And then going up to mode 5 and mode 6, we see another improvement over even mode 4. So mode 4 on 32K FFT size, basically looks like as good as it's going to get. But on 192K FFT size, there is still a small improvement to be had by going all the way up to like mode 6 or mode 5. And again, with mode 5, there's the issue of well, that's not 1.2 volts, unfortunately. So that's kind of annoying. Mode 7, I would say, is useless. It does, well, yeah, no, it's useless, because that says 1.27 right there, 1.25, so that's the same gap, that's the same gap, that's actually, yeah, that's a bigger gap. This is the same gap, this is the same gap, but these two are the same gap. So, the thing is, if you're already at mode 5, I don't see a reason not to use mode 6, because the actual difference in how much droop you have from mode 6 relative to mode 5 is very small, right? You're only going from 1.3125 to 1.325, in terms of voltage setting, and like you pick up a whole like your idle voltage goes up 10 millivolts, but your load voltage picks up 10 millivolts of stability. Um, like actually no, it doesn't even pick up. Like it picks up 10 millivolts of undershoot, but so it gets 10 millivolts less undershoot according to the not that accurate oscilloscope. It could actually be like 6 millivolts because of the rounding, but um, yeah, like it's not like you don't see a huge increase in the required voltage at idle, and you get a nice little improvement in terms of like you get less undershoot, and then like yeah, you know, that's it. You get 10 millivolts less undershoot for 10 millivolts more idle voltage, which I'd consider that a pretty okay trade-off, especially considering that if you're on something like a 3950X, like the chip is so difficult to cool at high voltages that if you are doing a static overclock for daily, like you're not going to be idling it on 1.4 volts because mode 6 LLC at 1.4 volts is going to droop down to like 1.27, and cooling a 3950X on 1.27 volts is not a pleasant experience if you're running Prime 95, right? So that's kind of the thing is like I would like mode 6 I'd consider a very very acceptable. So basically on the Godlike, mode 6 is what I would consider the optimal LLC setting for a, well, really any CPU, because you have to understand if you have it like a 3900X, there's going to be less droop inherently because a 3900X is a 12 core versus a 16 core, unless there's a LLC. I mean, not LLC, but a load line difference between the two CPUs. So, like with Intel, if you have a 8-core CPU, it'll actually have a different load line than a 6-core CPU because that's just how Intel designs the spec. But I don't know for AMD. AMD doesn't make their design, like the design requirements public, which kind of annoys me. But yeah, it like assuming that the load line between the CPUs does not change, a 3900X on mode 6 LLC will end up at a higher full load voltage than a 3950X just because there's like 4 less cores, right? So yeah, I would probably run mode 6 even with a 3900X or 3700X or 3800X. I could have tested the 3700X, except don't really feel like doing that. I'd have to reconnect the die. Well, I wouldn't have to reconnect the DyeSense. I should though, but nah, I wouldn't. I guess I might do a test with a 3700X as well to just check that the droop is like it doesn't like a 3700X with 1.325 volts set and mode 6 LLC should not be hitting 1.2 volts. It should be hitting like 1.25. Yeah, it should be hitting like 1.25 instead of 1.2 just because it's got half as many cores. So I will do a check for that, but yeah, assuming that's true, then it's just like mode 6 is just generally the optimal LLC for the VRM of the X570 Godlike. Now let's talk about the Aorus Xtreme. Now the Aorus Xtreme is kind of interesting compared to the Godlike in that like the voltage range here is a lot smaller. The Godlike actually has a mode 8 LLC, which is even droopier than mode 7, and like, well, that's 1.375 volts already. Like I'm not punching in I was not interested in trying to test like 1.4 volts for mode 8 or in excess of 1.4 volts potentially. It's just like, especially considering mode 7 already doesn't show any improvement over mode 6, like no point. Anyway, with the Gigabyte Aorus Xtreme on the other hand, it tops out at like 1.337 volts with the normal LLC, which like that's the droopiest one there is, right? So that's kind of interesting to me. That is just like there's not actually like this board has a lot less just droop range in general, which is kind of annoying that the LLCs don't line up very well, considering that both of them use international rectifier controllers. I was kind of hoping this wouldn't be like they'd be very like similar, but nope. Also, the Gigabyte board has much finer, like it allows you to actually use 6.25 millivolt voltage increments instead of the 12.5 millivolt voltage increments that MSI forces you into. Anyway, so Ultra Extreme LLC on the Gigabyte board is just an absolute disaster. You should not use it. This is 100 millivolts difference. This is 110 millivolts difference. Like Ultra Extreme is terrible. Don't just don't. Extreme LLC is more of the same. Like it's doing even worse than the Godlike on the DyeSense, and the DyeSense readings on the Aorus Xtreme are actually much less noisy than on the Godlike, just because of where the DyeSense circuitry happens to be located and how I'm connecting to it. So here the DyeSense readings are a bit more accurate, but unfortunately that doesn't make them super comparable with the other board, which was picking up a bunch of noise from the VRM, which really kind of annoys me. But you know, even if you look at the socket measurements, like that's a 90 millivolt gap right there, whereas this is a 60, right? Like that is worse. That is significantly worse. So Extreme LLC just also like utterly worthless, right? Because the thing is also a Turbo LLC, we see a bit of an improvement, right? 20 millivolts on the DyeSense, 10 millivolts on the back of the socket. At the same time, it's also 1.206 volts because, like, initially I was trying to match the voltage there for the MSI board, but then I realized it's like, well, none of the LLCs actually align properly, so I'll just keep aiming for 1.2 volts no matter what after the Turbo. But yeah, Turbo doesn't really do much to fix the problems of Extreme. It's still, like, there's still too much undershoot. And then we go to High LLC. And, now there's a lot less undershoot. We've picked up 30 millivolts on the DyeSense, 30 millivolts, that's not even 30, that's 40 millivolts on the back of the socket. That's a huge improvement in undershoot. But interestingly enough, this board seems to have a really hard time with the 32K Fft size test, whereas on the Godlike, 192K is like the worst case scenario. For the Aorus Xtreme, 32K is worse actually for at some point. Like at the more extreme LLCs, it's actually better. And then as we get into the milder LLC or into the droopier LLCs, yeah, it gets worse. It gets for somehow it manages to get lower minimums, right? Even on the freaking DyeSense, which like this is supposed to be a less difficult load to do. Yeah, and actually, like, if you look at the overshoot, there's less overshoot on the 32K Fft test. But for whatever reason, like, the extreme, like, my theory on what's happening with the Aorus Xtreme is that the way the firmware of that voltage controller is configured is it's trying way too hard to suppress the overshoot. And that's what causes the extreme amounts of undershoot, because this is not like this 32K like these Prime 95 tests, they are not nice, synthetic step loads where you go from your, you run your 10 amps idle and then you go up to 100 amps and you stay at 100 amps for like 10 seconds or 2 seconds, like, or any number of seconds. Like, as if you're measuring seconds, you're already in the wrong time scale. Like, I'm looking at an event, like the transient I'm looking at occurs over a time span of a couple hundred microseconds, right? So it is a very quick event, and it is very violent, and it does cause crashes and blue screens and horrible things to happen. So that's why I test for it, because it's like, that's the worst case scenario. And this board basically just seems to just try so hard to suppress the overshoot that once the CPU, because the CPU basically stops pulling any current, and then it immediately goes right back under load. And so you get the board essentially trying to stop the overshoot no matter what. And then the CPU goes like, hey, you know how I was like not pulling any current like 10 microseconds ago? Yeah, I need 200 amps again. Can you do that for me, please? And the VRM at that point just kind of can't catch up to the demand. And we get a lot worse undershoot, right? Like, that's my theory on this. And especially because the transient for the 32K is actually, seems to be a little bit shorter compared to the 192K one, which is kind of like weird that the MSI board, like the MSI board has a harder time with 192K, right? Like that's 1.22 versus 1.19. 1.24 versus 1. Like, the MSI board consistently does better in 32K than it does in 192K. And then Gigabyte has sort of this weird issue where it's like they do really, like, It's not great in 192K either, but initially 192K looks worse than 32K, and then at some point you get to a point where the board's actually doing better in 192K than it's doing in 32K. So I'm really happy that I actually decided to test 32K, because initially I was only considering testing 192K instead of instead of also including 32K, but yeah, ideally, like if I had unlimited resources, the way I would be testing this is I'd have like a full sweep of Prime 95 from like 8K FFT size all the way up to like 500. Actually, 500 is probably excessive. Because once you get into the larger FFT sizes, it takes less and less, like the thing is, the larger FFT sizes basically start testing the memory more and more because they stop fitting into the cache of the CPU. If you have an FFT size that fits into the cache of the CPU, then the CPU can churn through those calculations very, very quickly without ever stalling out for memory. Whereas if you have a very large FFT size, well, it gets constantly just interrupted to wait for the RAM, and ultimately at some point it spends so much time waiting for the RAM that the current draw just is really, really low. So yeah, that's kind of an issue. Like, so well, that's kind of, interesting about how Prime 94.5 behaves like that. But yeah, ideally I'd be doing like a sweep instead of just a specific FFT size, but I'd need to figure out some different way to do the measurements then to also like go like, okay, these were the measurements from the 8K, these were the measurements from 16, these were the measurements from 32, from 64, from actually I think like the thing is the FFT sizes in Prime 95, like they're not like just multiples of 2. There's a bunch of weird sizes in between. Well, they're all multiples of 2, but they're like they're not like they're not like powers of 2, right? Like 192K is not a power of 2, and there's also 224. I think is a valid FFT size. Yeah, 224 is a valid FFT size. 256 is, of course. I'm not sure that 286 is, right? Like that's kind of the thing, and I think 324 is. So yeah, that's the thing, is like the step sizes are a bit weird, and you'd have to like track the results for each FFT size, and yeah, that I'm not really interested in figuring out a way to automate that kind of system. So just test 32 and 192K. Even ideally, you would want a much larger variety of workloads, but I only have so much time. So, anyway, just like the reason why, like in theory, you shouldn't need a variety of workloads. You should just throw the worst case scenario. But the thing is, it's just like, well, obviously, worst case scenario for the Godlike here is different from the Aorus Xtreme's worst case scenario, which in some conditions that ends up being 32K FFT size. But anyway, so yeah, Turbo LLC useless. High LLC, it actually starts being like kind of decent. Once we get to medium doesn't really make any major improvements over high. I mean, on the DyeSense we see a 10 millivolt improvement. On the back of the socket we don't. Though at the same time, well, it's that improvement in the DyeSense is consistent. So I guess I'd be like, again, the thing is the DyeSense measurements on the Aorus Xtreme aren't as nearly and anywhere near as noisy as what they are on the Godlike, but they're still not great. Like compared to the back of the socket measurements, it's not like, I'm not particularly happy with those measurements in terms of like how they're taken. It's just like they're not as like on the Godlike they're awful. On the Xtreme they're like they could be a lot better, but this is the best I can do for now. But anyway, so medium LLC is still not really spectacular, but at the same time consider that medium is like equivalent to MSI's mode 4, because that's 1.287, that's 1.287, though admittedly MSI is doing a better job at one. Well, yeah, like the thing is the results are swapped, right? Like Gigabyte has a slightly better 192K on medium with 1.287, and MSI has a slightly better 32K, right? Because 1.15 versus 1.16, but then 1.15 versus 1.16. And that's 1.21, so that's a 40 millivolt gap, and that is a 30 millivolt gap. But The socket on the Godlike might actually be slightly higher impedance because it consistently measures a slightly higher average voltage on the back of the socket. Um, so that just means the Aorus Xtreme is better at getting power through the power plane. But the thing is, like, I ultimately think like the Aorus Xtreme's physical config, like the power plane seems to be better, the capacitor configuration seems to be better, right? Like it's doing a great job of suppressing the overshoot by a whole freaking 40-30 millivolts. Um, and yet it just can't beat the Godlike on the undershoot, which I just think that's a controller firmware issue there, where it's just not responding quickly enough for whatever reason. Um, so yeah. Anyway, so medium LLC, we start seeing sort of comparable. That's a 30 millivolt gap versus a 40. So medium is still like, well, mode 4 on the Godlike isn't optimal either, but medium seems to be a little bit worse. And then when we get to like low and normal LLC, so low is actually less droopy than mode 5 on the Godlike. Or actually no, that seems to be about the same because this is 1.306 and the Gigabyte board has the finer adjustments. So obviously mode 5 at 1.3 would not give you 1.2 volts, but at 1.312 was 6 millivolts too high, whereas on the Aorus Xtreme, we got those 6 millivolt increments, so I can actually get my 1.2 volts correctly. But yeah, so low is comparable to mode 5. Mode 5 for the Godlike is doing like 1.14. I mean 40 millivolts versus 40 millivolts on the Aorus Xtreme, and we also see 40 millivolts and 32K Fft size. So at some point you're gonna reach like there's a wall for how good the how little undershoot you can have. Like there's a limit on that. At some point, it's no longer about how good the motherboard is. It's just a case of like, well, the CPU has like the socket has this much impedance and there's this much capacitance on the actual CPU package. So at some point, you're not limited by what's on the motherboard and what the motherboard is doing. You're just limited by what's on the CPU, right? Because the motherboard can't see into the future. It can't know ahead of time that, hey, the CPU is going to pull a bunch of current to try compensate for something that hasn't happened yet. Because that's roughly the only way you could get the VRM to like that would be the only way to keep seeing improvements past a certain point, because at some point you're just limited by the fact like the power is not going to get through the CPU socket quickly enough. It's no longer a problem of like how quickly does the VRM respond. Is like, well, the socket needs to just not be there. So yeah, so low, low LLC on the Aorus Xtreme is actually like that's a good LLC setting right there. That is a LLC that you should be running. Then there's also the option to go all the way down to normal. Normal does bring a slight improvement on 32K and a slight improvement on 192K. At which point it actually, it matches the Godlike with the 20 millivolts gap there and 30 millivolts here. Whereas the Godlike somehow manages, well, actually no, that's more like comparable to mode 6, which that's still 20 though. Though for some reason the dye sense is better, right? Like that's 1.2 versus 1.17 versus 1.2. Well, there's noise on that. Like that could be getting dragged down by all of the noise that the Godlike is picking up. So that could have been like a 1.17. And it's just too much noise on the signal. So I'm really annoyed that I can't, like, the thing is, it's so annoying to even connect to the DyeSense on the Godlike in the first place, and then it's just like, and the only location where I could have hooked it up is like, it's also really noisy. Great, lovely, love that. So basically, the Godlike's VRM seems to do a better job of in terms of responding to transients just in general. Once we get into LLCs that are like, you should actually run, like LLCs that you should actually use, in my opinion. So for the Godlike, that would be 5, 6, 7. You could probably get away with 4 as well. The boards are very close together in terms of transient response, right? Though I think like I do actually, like, I have the header for connecting to the voltage controller of the Aorus Xtreme. Like I can do that. And theoretically, I could do that for the Godlike as well, except there's no convenient pin out to do that on. Like, my Aorus Xtreme actually has like the 3-pin header for connecting to the controller, whereas the Godlike I'd have to add it, and there's not a dedicated spot on the PCB to do that, so it kind of sucks. Um, but yeah, so in the sort of default configuration, the Aorus Xtreme just it's like 10 millivolts worse, essentially, compared to the Godlike. Which the thing that this really makes me wonder, though, is when I was testing the Aorus Xtreme against the Asus Crosshair 8 formula, those results were also like really, really close, if I remember correctly. And that now makes me wonder, like, because if the Godlike is slightly beating the X570 Aorus Xtreme, what are the chances that the Godlike also beats the Crosshair 8 Hero and the Crosshair 8 formula and just maybe every single X570 motherboard out there, right? Like that is one thing I'm kind of wondering about. Um, so yeah, um, it's kind of that. Like those are the results. So, like Ultra Extreme, like on the Aorus Extreme, basically from Ultra Extreme to high LLC, I would consider it unusable. Like you should just not use LLCs that aggressive on the Aorus Extreme. And then medium still wouldn't start. I still wouldn't recommend it. Like this doesn't make me happy. Like this is decent, but yeah, I'm not thrilled with it. And this isn't good either. Um, but low and normal, like, which essentially, like, for the Godlike, I'd recommend, like, 5.6, and for the Aorus Extreme, I'd recommend low and normal, which, you know, those are essentially tied between the boards. You could actually argue this is better than that. Well, now, switching, the noise on the DiSense, I'm so annoyed with that. Like, it's just like, we need a tiebreaker. Can't have one because your second measurement for one of the boards is not actually that useful. But yeah, I find this really, really surprising, though, because the Godlike, it uses doublers. The capacitor, like, the other thing is the Godlike just in general has less capacitors, which I guess is why we're seeing so much more. Like, that could also be the other part of why the Godlike's seeing so much more overshoot. Is just like there's less capacitance on the Godlike. And well, the doublers don't seem to be doing anything, because in theory, if there's anything the doublers should be negatively impacting, it's the undershoot, and that's fine. Like the Godlike's doing a better job of the undershoot than the Aorus Extreme. So yeah, I'm really impressed. Like I'm really impressed that MSI has a VRM that performs that well. And then with the Aorus Extreme, I'm just kind of like I'm pretty disappointed at the same time. These like the LLCs that you shouldn't use, I'm disappointed with the results that they're producing, because essentially what we're seeing is like in order to achieve the same stability on high LLC as on low LLC, your load voltage would have to be 20 millivolts higher, right? Which actually in this scenario it wouldn't be, but in this, yeah, you'd have to set your, like, instead of yeah, if I wanted to get this minimum to match that, like, I'd have to be setting this to like 1.29, right? This would have to be set to like 1.293, which is an actual setting the Aorus Extreme allows, and then our average voltage would be 1.22 volts, and then our minimum would be 1.16, but that's 20 millivolts more average voltage. That's more power consumption, more heat, more everything. So yeah, that's kind of the thing, is like, and I really wonder if it would be possible. Like the issue is like, I did mention that I can connect to the controller of both of these boards because they're international rectifier, and I will get an intersil dongle in eventually. I've just been holding off on ordering that for a while now. But I am aware of the existence of the intersil dongle, and I will have one eventually. But yeah, like the thing is just like, even though I can technically try mess around with the configuration of the VRM of the Aorus Extreme, I know very little about control loops. So that's like not the best idea. Probably gonna, well, I guess I can do it with a CPU that I don't care too much about. At the same time, I don't really like I'm pre as far like I think most of the modern voltage controllers are somewhat idiot proof. Like if I really screw up the configuration, it'll be like the undershoot and overshoot will be horrible, but it won't let me like destroy the chip, hopefully. That's my main concern. Is like I screw something up and break the chip. Like it's fine for me to fiddle around with like changing switching frequency and load line settings. Like that's fine. That's not really a big deal. Fiddling with the actual like compensation settings is just like I am going to like that's where I can really screw something up. So yeah, it might not even be compensation settings. Like, I really wonder what it like, why the Aorus Xtreme just seems to have, because the undershoot is lower, right? So it's like evidently the capacitor bank or something is reducing the undershoot. So I mean the overshoot. So why is the undershoot so bad? Um, so yeah, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching, and also it seems to be that this one's a bit long, so I don't know. This one may or may not go public. Um, but yeah, thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe. Leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. And if you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a link to the AHOC Patreon down in the description below. Then there's also the AHOC Teespring store, which achieves the exact same thing as the Patreon, except instead of getting nothing but like, I don't know, a feeling of pride and accomplishment for for supporting me, you get like a shirt or stickers or a poster. So yeah, if you want to help out the channel, check out those links, and that's it for the video. So thanks for watching, and goodbye.